So these Storytime videos that I do periodically, well, they are true stories, of course, or else there'd be no point. And they're true stories, and there are lessons to be learned from them, and sometimes very bitter lessons. I think fundamentally the goal that I have in these videos is to show that reality is very messy, and things aren't black and white. You know, it's not that there are good people and bad people and decent people and indecent people. No, there are people, and sometimes they act in decent ways and good ways, and sometimes they act in very bad ways. And sometimes they act in very bad ways even as they are trying to be decent and good. and that's the ultimate contradiction about people, but that's how they are. So I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a very troubling story. It's very true. I'm just going to make up names for these people. And I can assure you I know the story very well, because actually two of the participants in this story of three people, well, two of these participants told me in great detail a lot of the ins and outs of this story. So let me get to it. You see, there was this man named John and this woman named Dolores. And they were, fairly young, fairly attractive, and they met at a party that I happened to be at. And they met at this party, and John was, at the time, this was in 2002, and he was, about 35, 36. And Dolores was about 12 years younger, I would guess, offhand. Yeah, 12 years younger, something like that. She was about 23, 24. She just started in her first big job, and she was doing very well professionally. And John was doing very well. He was an independent businessman and just doing very well, and just, very glamorous work. It doesn't matter what it was. I'm not going to get into it, because then you'd be able to identify him. But the point I'm trying to say is that, see, they were both very successful. They were both very attractive. Now, John was, he was about my height, about 6 feet, a little bit trimmer than I am, and just overall a handsome guy. And he had that charisma of a guy who's going places in his life, and he would eventually go places in his life. He would be very successful in just about everything that he did. And Dolores was sort of like petite, sort of like, I'd guess, like about 5 feet nothing, 5 feet 1 maybe. I mean, like a little thing, but she didn't look like a midget. She just looked like a very attractive woman, just proportionately small, just very petite overall. I wouldn't call her short, I'd call her petite. And she was very attractive. She was just extremely attractive. I mean, she was photogenic, sure, but she was also like sexy. She exuded just sexiness, She had like dark hair, long, and she just looked, she was hot. I mean, just as simple as that. Not more complicated than that. She was hot, and they made a good-looking couple, and they started dating, just like people do. They started dating, and everything was fine. Now, the thing is, though, see, how can I put this? There are certain class issues that we really don't like to talk about, but they exist whether we like it or not. And these two people came from slightly different classes. Now, John was more, frankly, let's call it more aristocratic than Dolores. And Dolores was sort of like lower middle class, but she'd gone up the social scale. And she was very aware of the social niceties and very aware, class conscious, if you want to put it that way. And there was this vibe that came from John. He never really told me this specifically, but I always got the vibe that he was sort of like dating Dolores, sort of like as a stopgap measure. She's very sexy, very attractive, very personable and charming and all the rest of it. But he didn't really see himself with her in the future. He was with her for now. And I think that Dolores fundamentally knew this. She felt this coming from him. And it rendered like a certain tension in their relationship. And things were going smoothly for like 6 months or something like that, maybe 8 months. And then they sort of like broke up, and then they'd get back together and break up and get back together. And it was like this push-pull kind of thing. And, Dolores told me that John's distance from her, his ability or this thing that he had of just distancing himself from her, just drove her crazy, because she wanted to be with him, to be his woman, right? And he just held her there. And well, this started like, I think in 2002, and they were like off and on for 4 years. You know, just like they'd be together for a while and break up, and you know, there was this vibe of John that whenever he was like between girlfriends and he was getting kind of lonely, he'd call her up, and she'd come running, you know, and more than once she just ditched some guy she started to see in favor of John, to be back with John, because she wanted him very badly. She wanted to be with him. Okay, she saw her future with John. Right? But John didn't see his future with her. It's as simple as that. And so whenever he was, you know, between girlfriends or lonely, he'd call her up and she'd come a-running, like they say, right? It's tragic. Now, around the time that Dolores turned, I guess she must have been like 28, 29, something like that. I mean, this thing with John had been going on for like 4 or 5 years now, right? I mean, I forget the exact dates, but it doesn't matter. She was around 29, 30 or so, 29, 28, something like that. And she started seeing a guy, okay? And this guy was called Robert, another fictitious name, right? So she started seeing Robert, and it was pretty serious. It was pretty serious, and Robert was a great guy. He was just a great guy, very successful, very ambitious and driven. Not so shiny and great as John, perhaps, but Dolores figured, you know, he's good enough, you know. Robert was very successful, okay? I mean, financially successful, career-wise, socially, you know, he was a fun guy. He was great. But, you know, the way things are, Dolores always had a thing for John, and John was always on her mind. And apparently Robert sensed this, because there was just a lot of tension between Dolores and Robert, right? Now Robert wasn't like a beta orbiter or some shit like that. He was like a guy's guy. He was pretty cool. And in a way, I met Robert just a couple of times. To tell you the truth, I think I liked him better than I liked John. Okay, I mean, if truth be told, I mean, we're telling truth here. I think that he was just a nicer guy. Not just like a nice guy, like a beta cuck. I'm saying that he was just a more pleasant man, just a more enjoyable man. You know, he seemed more relaxed, because John had kind of like an intensity and an assholishness that could be really off-putting, right? But Robert didn't have this problem. And to tell you the truth, I mean, if it had been up to me, I would have told Dolores, as I did. I would have told Dolores, forget about John, stick with Robert. Of course she didn't do that. Of course not. What the fuck, right? See, because like a woman, you know, gets it into her head that she wants some guy and she'll want him forever. Okay, I don't know what it is, the chemistry of it. You know, I'm sure scientists and people more learned than I can say that, oh, it's because of this hormone or this or that, this psychological thing or whatever the fuck. It doesn't matter what it is or the reason it happens. But it seems to me that women sort of like get hung up on a guy. And it might be a chemical thing or a psychological thing or a combination thereof, but they get hung up on that guy. And every other man she's with knows it. Every man knows, you know, if the woman he's with is hooked on him or somebody else, some other guy from the past. Or maybe she's not even hooked on some guy from the past. Maybe she is still unhooked. But you, as a man, you will always be able to tell if the woman you are with is hooked on you or not. And Robert sensed that Dolores was not hooked on him. She liked him a lot. She thought he was great. She wanted to build a family and a life with him, but she wasn't hooked on him. Well, this led to tension, of course, and breakups and fights and tears and all the rest of it, the usual thing. And of course, whenever Dolores and Robert would break up, you know, she'd go running to John, right? And John, being a bit of an asshole, would be like, oh, why not? She's coming of her own free will, he'd say. I mean, I'm not calling her. She broke up with Robert and came to me, called me, and came over to my place, and of course we fucked, So whose fault is that? Mine or hers, he would say. And he told me this more than once, He's a bit of a scumbag, but whatever. Anyway, what happened finally around 2000... This was like 2006, 2007, or 2008, something around there. I mean, a while. Dolores is past 30. She's closing in on 31 or 32 maybe. And in one of these breakups with Robert, she goes to John and she gets pregnant by John, right? And that all of a sudden, it's like the whole thing comes to a screeching halt, right? Because it's all one thing to be with somebody and break up and then go with somebody else and back and forth and all this shit. But all of a sudden, there's a kid, right? And Dolores realizes, she's past 30. She gets an abortion, and what happens if nothing happens in terms of having a kid? And she wanted kids. She wanted several kids, right? And so she is like adamant that she's not going to get an abortion. She's not going to get an abortion no matter what. And John, he's fine with that. He's fine and dandy, but he says to her, I'll support you financially, no question. And John was of a level of income and wealth that he could afford to maintain Dolores. And she didn't even have to work. He could maintain her easily. Apartment allowance, the whole shebang, child support, whatever was necessary. He was willing to do that, but he wasn't willing to marry her, okay? It's not that he had somebody else. He just didn't want to marry her. Now, he couched the language as to say, well, I don't want to get married. It's not for me, the institution of marriage. I'm like a lone wolf and that kind of bullshit. But the fact of the matter is that John just didn't want to marry her. And the proof of this is that a few years later, John actually did get married to some other woman. Who is, it doesn't matter about the other woman, but the point is, he didn't want to get married to Dolores. He created excuses, but he didn't want to marry her. Now, he wasn't a son of a bitch. He wasn't just going to turn his back on Dolores and their child. On the contrary, he said outright, he'll buy her a place, give her, an allowance and child support and the whole thing. Above and beyond what a court or a judge would order him to pay, he would pay happily. Okay? But he wouldn't marry her. Now here comes the part that is, I don't know. Because, see, here's the thing. See, it's not that Dolores, Mr. Period once and then Mr. Period twice and then, went and got a pregnancy test and realized that, she was pregnant, okay? It was sort of like within a month's time of their sexual activity that created this pregnancy, she had taken the test and she knew she was pregnant. So to tell you the truth, to the people who heard the story and knew the gritty, grotty details, it seemed as if she'd deliberately gotten herself pregnant by John, okay? Sort of like to force the issue, force him to marry her. And he didn't, He did everything, he was going to do everything that was legally and socially necessary, but he would not marry her. And so here comes the terrible part. Dolores turned around and went back to Robert and, smoothed things up with Robert, patched things up, and announced that she was pregnant by Robert. She cuckolded him. That's how it happened. Now Robert, he was thrilled. He was thrilled that she was pregnant and he wanted a kid and he married her, And, everything seemed fine for a while, okay? For a while. The baby was born, and to tell you the truth, I don't quite know how Dolores finessed the issue of the dates, but, Robert seemed fine, and so all good. They're like this little family, right? And John, semi-bastard that he was on the one hand disappointed because he felt that he had been supplanted as the father. But on the other hand, he was a little bit relieved that he didn't have to fork over the cash, because even though he could afford it, he wasn't thrilled to having to be, shelling out, 10, 15 grand a month for this child of his, so he was glad that he didn't have to pay that, but he was, unhappy that he wouldn't get to see it. But at the same time, he was of an age and a personality that he was like, fuck it, and he moved on with his life, right? And, everything would have been fine, except Robert started to suspect, okay? And he started to suspect, and he eventually, when the child was like 5, 6 years old, apparently, he got one of these DNA tests. At the time, it was like when really at the very start of this whole fashion of getting DNA tests for ancestry and all that shit. And it was sort of like an expensive test, but it was still easy. It was just, a little swab of the cheeks, and that was that. And he got it, and he got back the results, and the kid wasn't his, right? And, this was a whole blowout. It ruined the marriage. It destroyed the marriage, okay? And it also destroyed the marriage because it came out later that Dolores had tried to get with John again, after she was married to Robert, to have a kid with John, a second kid. And they'd actually tried. I mean, they'd actually, had a little fling, a weekend fling. I guess it didn't take that second time, right? Now, this is a true story. It's a true story, and it's a very unhappy story. Poor Robert, of course he'd grown fond of this child. I mean, he considered this child his own, But after he knew that he wasn't really the father, the relationship deteriorated, rather slowly but inevitably, They separated, of course, and Robert was stuck paying the bill. He was paying the bills for another man's child because legally, it was too late to go through the whole rigmarole. Robert tried, and the thing is, very quickly, the law where this happened was such that after a certain period of time, you can't really forego your responsibilities as a father, even if you might not happen to be the father, right? So poor Robert was left, holding the financial bag, holding the emotional bag, and Dolores and her kid today live in a very nice house that Robert pays for, and Robert has almost zero contact with the child he raised for the first 4, 5, or 6 years of his life. And this boy is also called Robert. It's kind of tragic, and the boy now is, I think, like 13 or something like that. I mean, to tell you the truth, I forget the dates of this whole situation, or 11, something like that. It doesn't matter. The point that I'm trying to make here is that, see, these stories happen all the time. They happen all the time, and they're really quite tragic, and they have to do with, I guess, selfishness. I don't know what it is. It's just, selfishness, desire, whatever. It's the animal instinct. For whatever reason, Dolores thought that John was better for her, and she refused to move on, and she refused to accept the fact that John just didn't want to be with her. I don't think that John was necessarily a complete bastard. I mean, he didn't try to do anything in terms of like getting rid of the kid. I mean, an abortion, and he didn't. From what he told me at the time, he seemed more than willing to fork over all the necessary money to support this child. I mean, he had no problem with it, with footing the bill. Okay. But Dolores decided that she wanted to have a man by her side, and so she went and did this to poor Robert. Okay. And she must have realized, because she was a very smart woman, a very smart woman, and no dummy by any stretch of the imagination. So she must have realized that eventually there would be a moment where Robert would question it, right? Because the kid, didn't really look like Robert, okay? And as the kid grew up, he would look more and more like John, which is the case, as a matter of fact. The kid looks a lot like John. I mean, a lot like him, okay? And so, it's just, and this is what happened. So Dolores was selfish, a selfish cunt. You want to call her that and say that it's all her fault? Well, you can say that, but you have to understand that sometimes people do things and they seem cruel and evil. But you know, like, I know Dolores quite well. I knew her a number of years before she met John. She's a very decent woman, a very hardworking woman, very decent and kind. She did a lot of things that I witnessed personally that I'm not going to get into, but that I saw her do very kind things that she didn't need to do that cost her a little bit. I mean, that's the true definition of charity, of true charity, of helping others when there's a slight or sometimes a substantial cost and there's no benefit at all for you. I saw her do that. She was a very kind woman, okay? And she had this picture of what she wanted to have. She wanted to have a family with a lot of children because she thought that the whole career thing was all good and fine, but really it wasn't as important as having a family. She thought that having a family was more important, and she wanted one. And she wanted one with John. And she set her mind to getting John. And because she was such a successful woman all of her life, and because she had climbed so much in her life, she thought that she could get John. She thought wrong, right? And this is what happened. Now, this is a story, and you could take it as you will. There are a lot of lessons to be drawn. If you take the lesson that Dolores was an evil bitch cunt, then you're missing the point, okay? People do all kinds of things. That's the point. Decent people do all kinds of things. You can say that John was a bastard, but John didn't want an abortion. He wanted to support the child. And Robert, he abandoned this child, but Robert loved this child very much. He just, when he discovered that the child wasn't his love for this child simply changed. It no longer was a fatherly love. It was the love for a child that is really just a stranger. It's not really his, you know? It's a tragedy for all involved. The situation is such that everybody has enough money that the money thing is not the real issue. The issue is love and affection and what could have been but did not happen. Yeah. It's a tragic story, and it happens all the time.